At the family dinner, my son raised his voice not at me, but about me. "Get this useless old woman away from the table," he said. And just like that, I disappeared from my own bloodline. 2 days later, he called to say I shouldn't see my grandson for a while. "It's better for Liam," he said with the same voice I used to sing lullabies to. I stayed silent. I didn't beg. I didn't fight. I just disappeared. But life has a strange way of forcing truth into the light. Because 3 months later, I stood in the courtroom and watched my son fight for custody of his own child against a woman who once called me garbage. I watched him stutter when the judge played the tape of his wife mocking the elderly, poisoning his son against me, and laughing about how easy it was to twist him. I saw Ethan break right there on the witness stand as he realized the mother he cast aside was the only one who had ever stood between his family and ruin. I'm Elowyn Caldwell. And this is not a story about revenge. It's a story about what happens when silence costs too much and when love finally remembers its name. Before I share it all, would you let me know you're here with me, comment listening below, or tell me where you're watching from? If you've ever been pushed aside by the ones you raised, subscribe to this channel, because no dignity should be disposable. Thank you. And now, here's my story. They say time softens edges, but that night I learned some things cut deeper with age. I'm Elowyn Caldwell, 70 years old. I used to run the Caldwell's Sweet Haven bakery chain across Georgia. People once lined up around the block for our peach cobbler and pecan cookies. These days I live alone in a small brick apartment above a flower shop in Savannah's historic district. I gave up the storefronts, the publicity, the relentless noise of business, but I never gave up the part of me that loved baking for people I love. So when my son Ethan called to invite me to my grandson Liam's 5th birthday, I was hopeful. "Just a cozy little gathering," he said. "Family only." I believed him. I spent all morning making Liam's favorite brown butter pecan cookies using the exact recipe he and I baked together last Thanksgiving when Madison had a migraine and left me to entertain him alone. I packed them carefully in a round tin I'd saved from Ethan's 8th birthday, the one with the cartoon astronaut sticker he'd insisted stay on the lid. I dressed in my favorite floral dress. The colors had faded with time, but it held memories stitched into every seam. I even ironed it, though arthritis made the pressing slow and clumsy. But when I pulled up to Ethan's new home in the suburbs, I immediately knew something was wrong. The house looked like a venue. Strings of lights wrapped every column. White tents stretched across the lawn, and valets in black shirts gestured me toward a gravel turnaround. This wasn't a family gathering. It was a gala. I stood at the door with my cookie tin heart pounding like I was showing up uninvited. Madison opened it. Her eyes skimmed over my dress, pausing on my worn shoes, then flicked to the tin in my hands. "Oh, you didn't need to bring anything," she said, flat smile, holding back a sneer. She didn't take the tin. Inside, it was worse. Guests floated between marble countertops and catered displays. Laughter echoed through curated floral arrangements. No one looked like family. They looked like magazine covers, real estate moguls, boutique investors, Savannah's elite. No one spoke to me. No one noticed me. Until Liam. He spotted me across the room, his little voice cutting through the din. "Grandma Elowyn." He ran to me, arms flung wide. I dropped to my knees, hugging him tight. He still smelled like apple shampoo. That moment was warm, real. But then Madison swooped in. "Let's wash hands first." "Okay, Grandma's been out," she said, tugging Liam away as if I were something contagious. At dinner, I found a spot at the far end of the table. The seat felt cold. I watched Ethan laughing too hard at a joke he didn't seem to understand. I tried to speak to Liam beside me, telling him the beginning of his favorite story, the one about the princess who saves herself. But Madison cut me off. "Oh, honey, she'll get your clothes all dirty." A few guests chuckled awkwardly. I sat back in silence. Later, I tried pouring Liam some juice. Madison leaned toward Ethan, whispered something I couldn't catch. And then my son, my Ethan, lifted his voice for all to hear. "Madison, get this useless old woman away from the table." The room fell quiet, utterly silent. I stared at him. The boy I raised alone after his father died, the one I walked to school rain or shine, now looked at me like I was trash cluttering his perfect picture. Madison stood and touched my arm with fake gentleness. Maybe you should rest, Mom. You seem overwhelmed. I tried to reach for Liam, but Madison had already pulled him away. Ethan didn't look at me. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the untouched salad in front of him. I walked out without a word. My hands trembled so violently I dropped my keys twice. Behind me, the heavy door clicked shut. It felt like the end of something I hadn't even known was breaking. I didn't turn the lights on when I got home. I sat in the dark, the cookie tin still unopened on my lap. My reflection stared back at me from the hallway mirror, an old woman with hands too shaky to press her dress properly, eyes rimmed red, not from age, but from betrayal. I had built something once, something real. After my husband died, I poured everything into that bakery. Caldwell's Sweet Haven started as a folding table at the farmer's market and grew into a beloved name across Georgia. I hired women like me, older folks, single parents, those overlooked elsewhere. We made good things with our hands. And Ethan, he knew that. He grew up behind the counter playing with flour bins and licking icing spoons. I thought he remembered. But standing outside that mansion tonight, I realized he didn't remember a damn thing. The next morning, I called Lila. She had been my right hand through the toughest years. Now she managed my community baking programs and helped coordinate donations. I told her I need to know more about Madison. Lila hesitated. Are you sure, Elowen? You might not like what you hear. Tell me anyway. Madison, it turned out, had a pattern. She ran a high-profile event planning firm and often subcontracted work to community members. On paper, it looked generous supporting locals. But in practice, she'd fired Clara, one of my former pastry chefs, because her hands shook slightly. Too slow, Madison had said. Samuel, a loyal delivery driver, was let go after 20 years. Didn't fit the brand. Rosa, once my floor manager, got blacklisted for not answering a 2 a.m. email. It wasn't just me. Madison made a habit of discarding people once they passed some invisible threshold of usefulness or youth. I pressed the cold cookie tin tighter to my chest. I'm not looking for revenge, I said, but I won't pretend anymore. That evening, I began drafting a plan. I asked Lila to reach out to Madison with an invitation. We were organizing a high-profile charity event downtown, something to showcase civic leadership, and I said Madison was the perfect fit. Let her shine, I told Lila. We'll let her show everyone how valuable she really is. Privately, I arranged the assignments. Madison would be placed in the kitchen logistics team, dishes cleanup, pantry management. A team staffed almost entirely by those she'd once deemed too slow or too irrelevant. Clara, Rosa, even Samuel. I would be there too. Not as Elowen Caldwell, but as Eleanor, the older volunteer in the back, with a tattered apron, a quiet smile, and a notebook in her pocket. This time, I wouldn't be ignored, and I certainly wouldn't be silenced. What Madison didn't know was that the woman she humiliated at that birthday table hadn't disappeared. She'd simply stepped into the shadows to watch. And remember, 3 days of the charity event had begun. I arrived before sunrise, apron, folded neatly, disposable gloves in hand, name tag pinned to my shirt, Eleanor, a new elderly volunteer invisible in the bustle of the kitchen. No one suspected a thing. Certainly not Madison. She entered just after 9 a.m., high heels clacking against the linoleum, her tailored dress entirely inappropriate for a kitchen, though perfectly curated for her social media feed. She gave the room a once-over, the kind you'd give a damp locker room or a rundown bus stop. Her nose wrinkled not from any smell but from the people. Her voice rang out before anyone asked her to do anything. I'd prefer to stay away from anything greasy if possible. Lila, already prepared for the resistance, offered her a clipboard and a place on the dish team. We're short in sanitation today, she said cheerfully. You'll be such a big help. Madison blinked, obviously offended, but unwilling to make a scene in front of other volunteers. She nodded stiffly and adjusted her pearl earrings. I returned to sorting utensils beside Clara, who paused mid-movement when she saw Madison. Clara's face fell. A mixture of surprise and quiet dismay colored her expression. Madison looked right past her and pretended not to recognize her at all. During our first break, I sat quietly behind a prep station, sipping weak coffee from a foam cup. I overheard Madison speaking with Jasper, a bright young volunteer barely out of college. Her tone was light sarcastic. "These people really think they're helping?" She said, her voice tinged with amusement. It's kind of sweet in a tragic way. Like watching old VHS tapes and pretending it's still the 80s. I gripped my cup tighter. My other hand slid into the front pocket of my apron and retrieved my notebook. I wrote it down word for word. There was no satisfaction in it. Only clarity. A bitter kind of stillness settled over me like a window, slowly icing from the outside. Later that afternoon, as she dried dishes with exaggerated care, I passed behind her on my way to the pantry. I heard her talking again this time to another volunteer with that same casual cruelty cloaked in mock intimacy. Ethan once told me she laughed that his mom cried when she couldn't afford to pay his tuition, like full-on sobbing in the kitchen. Can you imagine? That kind of desperation just clings to some people for life. I froze. That story, my moment of weakness long buried, told only once in a quiet kitchen at night, when Ethan was 17 and I wasn't sure how I'd get him through senior year, had never been spoken to another soul. My knees weakened beneath me. I steadied myself on a counter and took a breath. She had made it a joke. A cocktail anecdote. Something to laugh about. And Ethan had given it to her. Not just the story, but a version of me stripped of all the years I spent standing between him and every hunger, every debt, every broken promise. I went back to stacking pans, my hands trembling but steady enough to keep moving. That night, I didn't sleep. I wrote down everything she said, every gesture, every laugh. And I wrote my own memory of that tuition night, how I cried quietly after hanging up the phone with the financial aid office, how I pawned my mother's brooch the next day to make the deposit. No one had ever laughed about that before, until Madison. On the second day of the event, I resumed my position in the kitchen, cutting vegetables, sorting dry goods, wiping down trays, always nearby, always listening. Madison floated around the perimeter, her phone glued to her hand like a prop. She answered calls, loudly used phrases like client activation and brand alignment, never once making eye contact with the women chopping onions beside her. "Why are we even doing this here?" she said to someone on the other end. "The crowd is practically retirement home chic." "It's like a fundraiser for the obsolete." Rosa flinched. Clara stopped mid-stir. Madison wasn't whispering. She wasn't hiding it. She simply assumed no one here mattered enough to challenge her. Clara looked at me and opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her cheeks were red. Her hands never stopped working. Around noon, I walked past Madison's station. She'd left her laptop open on the table, the screen still bright. A draft email sat unsent. The subject line, "Staff Realignment Proposal, Volunteer Roles." The first paragraph was all I needed to see. "We should consider replacing several current volunteers with a younger team to better reflect the energy and image of our event. Aesthetic cohesion is key." I turned away before she returned. She hadn't seen me. I knew speaking up now would only confirm her suspicions that someone was watching. She'd become careful. I needed more. Something she couldn't edit or delete. That evening, a pan of cornbread slipped from Samuel's hands and landed on the tile floor with a crash. He bent down slowly, apologizing before he even touched the pan. Madison clapped her hands once loud. "Unbelievable," she snapped. "Do you even belong in a kitchen anymore? Shouldn't you be somewhere with supervision?" The room froze. Samuel didn't respond. He finished picking up the tray, dumped the contents into the trash, and left quietly through the side door. I followed him 15 minutes later, finding him outside on a bench near the back alley, jacket thrown over his shoulders. He didn't cry. He didn't rant. He just sat there. "I thought volunteering would feel good," he said, looking at the trees. "I thought maybe I still had something to give. But I guess I'm just a liability now." I sat beside him in silence. I wanted to say something healing, but everything sounded like pity in my head. "Oh, I remember when you hired me," he said eventually. "You looked me in the eye and said, 'If your hands are steady and your heart is full, you belong here.'" No one said anything like that to me in years. I wanted to tell him he still belonged, that his hands and his heart were still as capable as ever. But the truth was, the world had changed its definition of worth. And Madison had written the new script. Back inside, I caught Jasper and asked if he'd heard anything more from Madison. He nodded cautiously. She said Elowyn Caldwell was bitter, that she couldn't let go of being relevant. Like she's stuck in some past version of herself and can't accept that no one really needs her now. I didn't flinch. Not in front of him. But later in the storage closet, I leaned against a stack of canned goods and pressed my forehead to the wall. It wasn't just Madison's voice I heard in that insult. It was Ethan's. He had painted that picture. She merely colored it in. Whatever came next, I realized, wouldn't be about public redemption or clever plans. It would be about taking back something quietly stolen, not my reputation, but the truth. The final day of the charity event began with a strange and sudden shift in the air. The kitchen felt unusually light, as though someone had thrown open a window and let in false spring. Madison arrived earlier than usual, her heels replaced with flats, her face made up with the kind of minimal elegance that said, "I care, but not too much." She greeted the volunteers like old friends. She handed Clara a cup of tea and said she admired how gracefully she worked under pressure. She patted Rosa gently on the shoulder and complimented her for managing the logistics like a pro. Even Samuel received a nod of approval as she passed him by. Something about it felt rehearsed, too polished. I had seen her true tone, heard her real words when no one of perceived importance was watching, and so I began to listen even more closely. Later that morning, I approached Jasper during a break and asked if he'd consider recording any further conversations. He hesitated, unsure. But that same afternoon, Madison trampled a folded application Samuel had left on a chair. She looked down at the paper, smiled, and stepped over it without pause. Jasper saw. And he didn't hesitate after that. That evening, the community center filled with council members, donors, and a few local reporters for the event's closing remarks. Chairs were arranged, cookies and lemonade set out. Madison took the mic. Her voice was syrup smooth, her delivery practiced. "We've built something special here," she said. "A space without barriers where young and old, regardless of background or ability, contribute equally. I've been humbled to work alongside so many dedicated volunteers." The crowd applauded. People smiled at each other, touched by the performance. I stood behind the curtain, hand clenched around the small notebook I'd filled over the past 3 days. I didn't know whether Ethan would believe me, but I had to believe the truth still mattered. After the applause faded, Madison made her way toward the back hallway where I was stacking extra chairs. She didn't recognize me at first. Her voice was quiet but unmistakably condescending. "You know," she said, eyes scanning the hallway for ears, "you people should be thanking me. Without this event, most of you would still be sitting at home crocheting or reading Reader's Digest. At least here you got to feel useful again." I turned and faced her fully. "You don't know who you're talking to." Her brow furrowed. She tilted her head. Then her eyes narrowed. "Elowyn." I pulled off my hat, slowly letting my silver hair fall over my shoulders. "I've been here the whole time, every word, every laugh at someone else's expense." Her face drained of color. She gave a short, breathy laugh. "You misunderstood. I was testing the team's resilience. That's how you lead. Sometimes you have to create pressure to see who shines." I said nothing more. I didn't need to. Her mask was cracking, and she knew it. As I walked away, I felt no triumph, only gravity. The kind that settles in your chest when you realize the people closest to you may never know the whole weight of what you carried. Because Ethan still didn't know. And I hadn't yet decided whether I had the strength to show him. 2 days after the event, Madison reappeared. Not in the kitchen, not in the community space, but in my life. She called me that morning. Her tone was composed, almost pleasant. "Can we meet somewhere neutral? I think we should talk." We agreed on a small coffee shop near Foresight Park. I arrived 10 minutes early. She walked in exactly on time, dressed like she was heading to a casual board interview, pressed slacks, silk blouse, pearl studs. She sat down across from me with a practiced smile. "We're both adults." She began folding her hands neatly. "So let's be honest. I know what you did. Disguising yourself like that, gathering dirt. That wasn't exactly dignified." I said nothing. "You set me up. You knew exactly what you were doing. Making me look like the villain in front of your little band of misfits. And now Ethan is asking questions." Her voice sharpened as she leaned forward. You want him back, don't you? You want him to see you as the only woman in his life who matters. I looked at her for a long moment before speaking. I want him to see clearly, that's all. Madison laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. You think he's going to believe you over me? He's my husband, the father of my child. He doesn't want conflict, he wants peace. And I know exactly what to say to give him that. She adjusted a bracelet, flicked an invisible speck off her blouse. I'll tell him you're bitter, that you never approved of me, that this was your way of punishing me for being young, successful, for giving him a life you never could. And you know what? He'll believe it. Because you've kept your own story hidden for so long, even he doesn't really know who you are. She leaned in even closer, her voice low and venomous. Ethan is mine, and he needs a family rooted in reality, not nostalgia. He doesn't need a mother who plays games behind closed doors. I looked her in the eye, calm as I could manage. A real family doesn't grow from shame or manipulation. She stood up without finishing her drink and walked out of the cafe without another word. 2 days later, Ethan called me. His voice was distant, clipped. I think we need some space, Mom. My throat tightened. I just want what's best for Liam. And right now, that means keeping him away from tension. He's been picking up on things. I asked what things. He hesitated, then said, You pretending not to be who you are, sneaking around, making judgments. I tried to explain. I told him I had reasons for staying quiet, that I never meant to hide who I was, only to keep things simple. But he interrupted. You should have told me about everything. You let me believe all these years that you were just living modestly. And all this time you had a legacy you never shared. He didn't say it out loud, but I could hear it. He felt tricked. That night, I sat on my porch in the dark, my phone cold in my hand. For the first time in a long time, I let the tears fall without trying to catch them. I had thought I was strong enough to watch the house I built crumble slowly, but no one ever tells you how sharp the sound is when it breaks from the inside. I tried to remain calm. I told myself that time would allow the truth to breathe, that eventually things would settle. But as the days passed, the silence grew thicker. There were no messages, no dinner invitations, no little hands knocking at my door. It felt like Liam had disappeared from my life entirely. I walked to the market as usual, stopped by the bakery near my building for fresh rye, even past the playground where I used to push Liam on the swings. But he was never there. Not with Ethan. Not with Madison. Not at all. Lila stopped by with a casserole and a heavy look in her eyes. She's telling people you're unstable, she said, that you're spiraling. She says you're struggling with loneliness and making up stories. She's calling it a kind of elderly desperation. I felt a strange numbness spread across my chest, like my ribs had stopped protecting anything. I sat down, hands in my lap, staring at the casserole dish. Madison was winning not through reason or truth, but by eroding my image piece by piece until I was small enough for people to step over without guilt. And then one afternoon, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Hello, I answered, voice hesitant. Grandma. The voice on the other end was soft, almost a whisper. It's me, Liam. I closed my eyes. Ba oi. Tai sao me kong shou kong gappa, he said, switching back and forth between the English he was learning and the Vietnamese phrases he knew I loved. Me noi balang goi sao, nung kon kong tin dao, kon no chuyen kong chua. I gripped the arm of the couch with one hand to steady myself. The other held the phone so tightly I heard the plastic creak. I told him he was very brave to call me, but he couldn't do it again. It wasn't safe for him. You're a good boy, I said, and I will always love you, always. But this isn't your burden. His voice broke when he whispered, Con muon, ba, kitiep, chuyen, kong, chua. I'll write it down, I said. And one day, you'll read it. After the call ended, I didn't cry, I just sat there. I didn't go to Rosa's gathering that weekend. I stopped answering Lila's texts. The pictures on my walls, once full of family and flower-dusted moments, began to feel like intrusions. I took them down one by one and laid them in a box in the back of my closet. My world narrowed, and for the first time, I wondered if I had done too much. Had I crossed some invisible line? Had I become the very kind of mother who stirred division where there had only been tension? I asked myself if I had been cruel, if I had been petty, if I had somehow, in trying to reclaim my voice, silenced Ethan's. But underneath the doubt was something more solid, a weight that grounded me. Madison had never apologized, not once. Not to Clara, not to Samuel, not to Liam, and certainly not to me. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was weaponizing silence, and Ethan still couldn't see it. The question now wasn't whether she deserved consequences. It was whether I still had the strength to show my son the truth. A week later, Jasper came to my door. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot as he stepped inside. "I got something," he said, "and I think you should hear it." He handed me his phone and pressed play. I heard Madison's voice, sharp and casual. "She thinks she's some kind of legacy. Like anyone remembers who she was. She's bitter. That's what she is. I told Ethan she's trying to destroy what we've built. And I'll keep telling him. I'll make him believe it. That's how you stay ahead of people like her. You control the story." I sat still. The room around me felt like it had stopped moving. I didn't feel rage. I didn't even feel sadness. I felt clarity. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't about generational differences or misunderstandings or even jealousy. It was about power and the length someone would go to keep it. Later that week, I took a walk through Foresight Park. It was warm, the kind of Savannah day that tricked you into forgetting what month it was. The fountains sparkled. Children ran in arcs across the grass, and then I saw them. Ethan and Liam by the sandbox. Liam spotted me first. He didn't hesitate. He ran into my arms like nothing had ever happened. Like our story hadn't been interrupted by grown-up shadows. I held him tight. Ethan approached slowly, hands in his pockets. "Hi, Mom," he said. I nodded. "Ethan." We made small talk. Weather, work, nothing real. When Liam ran to the swings, I handed Ethan a pair of earbuds and Jasper's phone. "There's something you need to hear." He looked at me with suspicion but took them. He listened. And with every passing second his face changed. The color drained. His jaw clenched. His eyes flicked back to mine once the recording ended. "Is this real?" Nodded once. He stared at the ground, then up at the sky. Finally he said, "I need to do the right thing. For once." That evening, Ethan invited me to their home. He said Madison didn't know I was coming. I hesitated but followed him through the door. Everything looked the same. The sterile luxury, the curated decor, but it felt different. Liam wasn't there. Ethan had asked a friend to watch him for the night. We sat in the living room. Madison entered, confused to see me. "What is she doing here?" she demanded. "Sit down," Ethan said. "And listen." He played the recording. At first she denied it. Then she attacked Jasper. Then me. She edited that. Or recorded me without context. This was all part of her plan. She's been trying to destroy me since the beginning. But Ethan didn't move. "I've been blind," he said. "I let you manipulate me. I let you shape my view of my own mother, of Liam's grandmother." Madison's voice rose, desperate. "She's the one who poisoned everything." Ethan stood. "No." She opened my eyes. "You're the one who made our home toxic." There was a long silence, and then Ethan said quietly but firmly, "I want a divorce." Madison's mouth opened, then closed. He continued, "I'll file for full custody. You'll have supervised visits until the court says otherwise. Pack your things. Tonight." She looked at me. There was no anger in my face. No pride. Just sorrow. I had once hoped she would change, that she would soften, that she would learn. But people like Madison rarely believe they need to. And that's how they fall. I left before she finished packing. I didn't want to see her broken. I had no interest in revenge, only in truth. And finally, I had spoken it, fully, without apology, without shame. Word spread quickly through the community. Not because we sent it to the news and not because anyone made a scene. It moved the way truth always does, quietly, persistently, on the backs of whispered conversations and long looks between people who'd finally seen what had always been there. Jasper, with my blessing, had shared the recording with the circle of volunteers who had worked that week. He didn't present it with outrage or fanfare. Just a simple message. This is what was said when no one thought you were listening. Clara and Rosa, who had long held their silence out of grace, began to speak. They didn't accuse Madison. They didn't raise their voices or cry out for vengeance. They simply told their stories. Clara spoke of being replaced by a younger baker at the last minute and told she was aesthetic clutter. Rosa described sleepless nights answering Madison's emails and how she was told to retire with dignity when she pushed back. People believed them. Because the words matched what they'd heard on the recording. Because pain, when it's spoken softly and plainly, cuts deeper than rage ever could. Soon, the circle widened. A major local sponsor, a philanthropic women's organization that had supported several of Madison's high-profile events, issued a public statement withdrawing support. Due to ethical concerns and a lack of alignment with our community values, it read. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt steady. Like a crooked picture on the wall had finally been straightened. Madison, of course, tried to outrun the damage. She relocated to Atlanta within the month, hoping to rebrand herself in a new city. But the world doesn't forget easily anymore. The recording followed her like a shadow she couldn't edit away. Partners withdrew. Clients hesitated. She lost her footing, then her livelihood, and eventually, her place to live. She returned to her parents' home in South Carolina, an address she never listed on business cards, and faded into avoidance. She wouldn't return calls. She deleted her public profiles. The polished image she built crumbled under the weight of her own voice. Meanwhile, Ethan quietly moved forward with the divorce. He didn't speak ill of Madison. He didn't have to. The evidence stood on its own, the words she'd used, the values she'd modeled for Liam. The court granted him full custody. Madison, through tears and shaking hands, was told she could only see Liam under supervised visits for 1 year. She blamed me again in front of the judge. But this time, there was no applause, no defense. Just a long silence, as if even the room itself had grown tired of her excuses. Ethan began bringing Liam to visit me every Sunday. At first, it was awkward. He watched me closely as if trying to rediscover who I was. But then came the laughter, the silly games, the way Liam would squeeze my hand and ask for the next chapter of the princess story, and every time I gave it to him, a little older, a little wiser. I never spoke ill of Madison, not once. I told Liam being kind isn't about who deserves it. It's about who you choose to be when no one else is watching. He listened. That's all I could ask for. Life didn't change overnight. I still lived in my small apartment. I still walked to the market. I still made my tea the same way I had for 20 years. But something inside me had shifted. I said yes again. To the community center. To helping with local events. When Rosa and Clara asked me to help with a bake sale for underprivileged children. I said yes without thinking. And this time, I didn't just show up, I leaned in. One evening, as I stood in my kitchen rolling dough, I felt something rise in me I hadn't felt in a long time, a calling not to reclaim who I had been, but to give what I had left. So I opened a bakery again. Not a chain, not a business, a place. Just a little storefront on a quiet street in Savannah, tucked between a secondhand bookstore and a florist who always gave away her broken blooms. I called it the Little Haven. No Caldwell this time, no personal branding, just a name that meant something to me, a safe place for those who'd once been told they didn't belong. Clara ran the front. Rosa taught weekend classes to teenagers interested in culinary arts. Samuel arrived every morning at 6 to make deliveries, humming an old Motown tune as he loaded the van. And Lila stopped by daily, still organized, still unshakably kind, still the voice that reminded me I wasn't alone. We didn't make a profit. We made peace. One week I gave Liam a notebook, handwritten pages, a story I'd been writing since the silence began. It was titled, The Princess Who Saved Herself and the Grandmother Who Never Gave Up. Each chapter held a little lesson, not moralizing, just reminders. The importance of speaking up, the strength it takes to forgive, the way love can look like showing up over and over again. Liam clutched the notebook to his chest and said, I'm going to read it to the kids at school. They should know what grandmas can do. And then came autumn. We planned a birthday for him. Not at a country club, not with expensive balloons or themed banners. Just a table at the Little Haven, strung with lights and paper cranes Liam had made himself. Cookies fresh from the oven, lemonade stirred by hand, faces that knew his name. When it was time for cake, Liam stood on a wooden stool and raised both arms like a conquering knight. My grandma beat the dragon, he shouted, beaming. Everyone laughed. I bowed a little, but inside I understood what dragon he meant. It wasn't Madison. It wasn't even what she'd done. It was the silence. The kind that crept in when we let ourselves believe we no longer mattered. And I had fought it the only way I knew how, by telling the truth, by staying open, by choosing kindness without permission. That night after the party ended, I stood outside, the Little Haven. The windows glowed golden behind me. Ethan was rinsing dishes, Clara was bagging leftovers, and Liam was coloring quietly in the corner. I watched them for a long moment. I no longer needed to be remembered as a businesswoman. That was never the legacy I wanted. I only hoped to be remembered as someone who stood back up not to punish but to protect. Not to be seen but to see. Not to reclaim what had been taken but to create something that could never be taken away. A story, a bakery, a boy. And the quiet, steady light of one woman who chose finally never to be quiet again. Sometimes what breaks us isn't loud, it's silence dismissal. The quiet way love turns into distance. But dignity doesn't expire with age. And the truth? It always finds a way back. No matter how long it takes, kindness leaves a mark deeper than cruelty ever could. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. And if you believe no one should ever feel invisible, subscribe, follow, and stay with me. Thank you for listening.